I start with the basic composition already planned out on the page. The painting is divided into a few main areas. The warm sunset sky at the top, the greenery and trees in the middle, the bright sun near the center, and the purple-blue water at the bottom. I begin with the upper part of the painting, working on the sky. I use strong warm colors, mainly red, orange, and yellow. I spread the paint across the upper section in broad strokes rather than trying to make it perfectly smooth. The red is strongest toward the top, and I gradually bring warmer orange and yellow tones into the lower part of the sky. This creates a glowing transition instead of having one flat color. At this stage, I'm mainly thinking about the overall atmosphere. The sky needs to feel bright and warm because it will contrast with the darker landscape and the cool colors that I'm going to add below. I also leave the central area lighter, because that is where the sunlight will become the focal point. Once the sky is established, I start working down the sides of the composition. I introduce green and turquoise tones to build the vegetation. Instead of painting the trees as solid, perfectly defined shapes, I use different strokes and colors to create texture. The darker greens help establish depth, while brighter greens bring some of the foliage forward. I continue building up both sides while keeping the middle more open. This naturally creates a kind of frame around the sun. I also add darker areas underneath and between the foliage. These shadows are important because they give the greenery more dimension and prevent everything from looking like one flat layer. Next, I move down to the lower section and begin developing the water. Here I switch to cooler colors, especially purple, blue, and violet. I use horizontal strokes because I want the direction of the brushwork to suggest the surface of the water. I layer different shades over one another instead of using just one color. The darker purple establishes the deeper areas, while brighter blue and lighter purple strokes create reflections. As I work, the lower half begins to contrast strongly with the warm orange and red sky above it. I keep the strokes loose and horizontal because the water doesn't need to be perfectly smooth. The variation in the brush marks makes it feel more reflective and alive. With the main background established, I start adding more recognizable forms. I work into the upper middle area with darker paint to create the branches and palm-like trees. The branches stretch inward toward the center, which helps guide the eye toward the sun. I don't make every branch perfectly symmetrical. Instead, I use curved and irregular strokes so that the trees feel natural. I also continue adding green highlights around the branches. These lighter marks sit on top of the darker background and give the foliage more texture. At this point, the basic landscape is becoming much clearer. The sunset is behind the trees, the greenery surrounds the center, and the water anchors the bottom of the scene. Now I focus on the brightest part of the painting, the sun. I build up the yellow paint in the center, using a brighter and more concentrated color than the surrounding landscape. The sun is deliberately irregular rather than a perfectly geometric circle. I use the brush to build up the shape and allow some of the surrounding colors to remain visible around its edges. I also work some yellow and lighter tones outward from the center. This creates the impression that the sunlight is spreading into the surrounding greenery. The contrast is important here. The dark greens and branches surrounding the sun make the yellow appear even brighter. This is where the main focal point really begins to emerge. After establishing the sun, I return to the water and strengthen its reflection. I add more horizontal strokes in blue, purple, lavender, and lighter tones. The reflection doesn't need to be an exact mirror image of the sun. Instead, I suggest the light breaking across the surface of the water. I vary the length and thickness of the strokes so the reflection feels textured. The brighter marks are concentrated more toward the middle, while the surrounding water remains darker. This helps connect the bright sun above with the water below. I continue layering colors until the water has enough variation to look illuminated rather than simply painted purple. Now I move into the foreground, where I begin adding the darkest shapes. I use very dark paint to create the silhouettes along the bottom edge. These shapes suggest vegetation and small plants along the shoreline. I build them up with irregular strokes rather than drawing each leaf individually. The dark foreground creates another layer of depth. We now have the distant sunset, the middle ground trees and water, and the much darker vegetation in front. I also add a few larger silhouetted forms that stand out against the water. These darker shapes are useful because they frame the bright reflection and give the scene a stronger sense of distance. At this stage, most of the major elements are already in place, so I begin refining rather than completely changing the composition. I add smaller touches to the trees, foliage, water, and reflections. I strengthen some of the darker branches and add brighter green marks where I want the foliage to catch the sunset light. I also continue working across the water with small horizontal strokes. These little marks add movement and help break up large areas of color. The goal here isn't to cover every empty space. I'm trying to create a balance between detailed areas and softer, more open areas. Once the landscape itself is finished, I work around the outside of the painting. I add and strengthen the gray and darker tones around the edges, which gives the artwork a defined frame. This also helps contain the very bright colors inside the scene. I make a few final adjustments to the transitions between the sky, trees, and water, adding color where areas need more depth or contrast. At this point, I'm mostly looking at the painting as a whole rather than focusing on one individual section. Finally, I add the last small details and highlights. I check the brightness of the sun, the surrounding greenery, the palm branches, and the reflection in the water. I add a few final strokes where I want more texture and contrast, especially in the foreground and water. The final image brings together the warm sunset, the bright yellow sun, the green landscape, the palm-like silhouettes, and the cool purple water. The main idea throughout the process was to build the painting in layers. First the large background colors, then the landscape, followed by the light, reflections, silhouettes, and finally the small details. And with those final touches, the sunset landscape is complete.